Can I just ask you about Arthur, Tom's father? Because one of the reasons that Tom assumes a kind of parental role is that his father, Arthur, dies not long after arriving in Melbourne. He's hit by a tram, a very Melbourne kind of death. But he dies believing that there are sort of blue petals in his mouth. It's actually a moment of aesthetic dislocation. And I wanted to ask about this, about the idea that it's not just that there are new objects and a slightly oblique language, but the aesthetic system is sort of shuddering as someone tries to readjust. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that moment of death that leaves Tom as the father figure.
I had a little tiny earlier scene when Arthur, who is English, who's gone to India during the war and then goes back there to live later and marries Tom's mother, who's an Anglo-Indian. Before he marries, he rents a room in someone's house, and this person has a lot of children, and Arthur lies there on his Bombay fornicator, which is one of those settlers' chairs, we call them.
That Bombay fornicator
but Bombay fornicator is so
much more interesting.
So much more interesting. And he drinks whiskey and he falls asleep every afternoon. And the children play games with him, and they place objects on his belly. Or once when he's snoring, one of the little girls places a blue flower on his tongue. And I just wanted to have at that moment of Arthur's death that he's just before he dies before the accident, he's looking up at the sky and seeing how, thinking about blueness, and he remembers a Sunday school picnic he went on when he was a little child, where he saw bluebells in a wood, and then he remembers this thing that he doesn't know whether it was a dream or was it reality. Is it a memory or the memory of a dream of waking up and finding blue petals on his tongue? And so I suppose I wanted to suggest through that that sense of strangeness, of sometimes things being so strange we don't know whether we've just dreamt them or imagined them, or did they really happen? I'm sure we've all had that moment of strangeness in our lives. And to suggest again the strangeness of Arthur's transportation to this new world, where he doesn't really want to come to Australia, he would rather stay on in India. And again, he's someone who, even at the moment of his death, is dealing with that, not knowing, is this reality or is it a dream?
I mean, that's a wonderful example of the sort of ingenuity of how Michelle thinks, because it's extraordinary, this little detail that you just pass over when you're reading about Arthur that comes back at the moment of death with a sort of symbolic force that is just penetrating, and you think, yes, perhaps that's how we die. We die with some little fragment, some enigmatic fragment that is unresolved, that just we've not released it. It's still hanging around right to the moment of death. And I did find that incredibly moving. And it's because it was planted in such a sort of fragile and conditional way early, I think.
Thank you.
Just this issue of the bluebells and India, I did want to ask you, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but in reading about post-colonial writers and writers from India and Sri Lanka, what I come across is what they call the daffodil syndrome, which is those writers or those educated in English in India and Sri Lanka who learnt Wordsworth, I wandered lonely as a cloud o'er vales and hills when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, in a country where there are no daffodils. And it's become a sort of trope of a dislocated aesthetics, having been given a whole set of rhymes and visions that actually don't fit where you are through the colonial heritage. And I wonder if I can ask how much that affected you as a child, and whether as a writer you're kind of still battling that, still trying to forge an aesthetics that is some kind of syncretic response. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. All your questions are good, Gail, the replies. But, you know, the daffodil syndrome. Yes, I even learned that as a child by heart. You know, I learned a lot of poetry by heart, and it was all English poetry. But I actually write a little bit about this in the novel. There's another convergence between Tom and me, because, of course, and, you know, as Australian readers, we feel the force of this, that, you know, you want to be reading literature that's produced within your own country as well as other kinds of literature. But the fact remains that certainly when I was a child growing up in Sri Lanka, there was just not a lot of literature in English being produced locally. And as a child who was addicted, a passionate reader, the books that were available, I mean, it was a very material constraint. The books that were available were English books. So the books in English, and because of all sorts of historical reasons that, you know, I can't go into now, really, my mother tongue is English, and many people in Sri Lanka speak English very fluently, and and that is the language in which the literature was available. Now, there are two ways to look at this, you know, and on the one hand, I think the kind of orthodox post-colonial reading is that this is a terrible thing. And certainly, you know, if that's exclusively what is available, it is sad. And I remember also, you know, reading books that were occasionally, there was nothing set in Sri Lanka, but, well, there were a few, but, you know, something like Kipling, reading Kim and being just delighted to find, although, you know, northern India's, the landscape's very different from Sri Lanka, but mentions of snake charmers and, you know, all that kind of thing that was daily reality for me, and not just ginger beer and well, I had ginger beer, but, you know, not just smugglers and so on, and daffodils. But at the same time, I think, you know, I was lucky also to have that. I think because it's, you know, it's nice to have a world described that is not just the world you are looking at too, and that you can imagine what a daffodil looks like or an apple tastes like. I was very disappointed when I first tasted an apple. I'd built them up greatly in my mind, and you know, there was something quite magical too about this whole empire of the imagination that only existed between the pages of books. That's
an excellent answer. I mean, there's a wonderful, there's a line in this book that Tom thinks how distressing it is that poetry recitation has fallen out of our culture so quickly. And one of the ways that he supports people is by reciting lines of poetry. And they're old English poems. Yes. And it is partly about that, the kind of compensation of the beautiful rhyming line. There's something so elementary in its solace, that there's a solace to ordering the world in these beautiful old-fashioned poetry. And he defends it, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. He does. And the book, there's a lot about, you know, things that are in the book. The lost things are sometimes things that are literally lost, and other times things that are undervalued or overlooked. And so I suppose I wanted to have all these little fragments of poetry, and a lot of the poetry is rather what would be considered daggy poetry, you know, not Rilke, of course, but, you know, that Tom is actually almost slightly sort of embarrassed about knowing, but he says, you know, he learnt this stuff as a child and it's in his mind and he can't get rid of it, and I feel like that sometimes. I've got an awful lot of trash in there. But, you know, it's like the way you hear pop songs or something and you can't get them out of your mind. And I did want, I'm glad you think that he, you know, he finds solace in those sort of beautiful just in the comfort of rhythm and rhyme, which I think is, especially to a child, very satisfying. And I'm glad, I had a very old-fashioned education, and I'm glad I did learn all those poems like the Daffodils. I think.
I mean, one of the things we haven't said is that Tom is a scholar, a literary critical scholar working on Henry James. And there's a sort of model of the Jamesian novel behind this book, and of a sort of Jamesian consciousness. And I'd like to ask Michelle to talk about that, because to me, as a big fan of Henry James, this is one of the most fascinating things. And I've read the novel a few times now, and each time I find more James. I don't know if it's all there, or if it's a figure in the carpet that I keep on sort of projecting. But one of the forms of lostness is the lost knowledge of others, and there is a kind of mystery in this text that is very much about the life of art. So we have Tom, who's working on a book on Henry James, or he's just finished it. We have Nellie, who's a visual artist, and we have a preoccupation with what art can do. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about the Jamesian model, and what you borrowed, whether it is just the kind of spookiness that James is interested in high consciousness as you are, in the density of consciousness, but also in the ghost story at another level.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things I like about James, is that, he is this incredible, the modern master, and then he writes also at the level of these Gothic tale, especially in the tales, and I think it's interesting that he tries to keep that stuff in his tales and keep it out of what he considers the major work, and yet it always finds its way into the novels as well. But because part of the thing was thinking of the novel, another kind of lostness in the novel is the sense in which we are haunted by things that are not there, or people who are not there, haunted by memories. And so I was thinking of it as a kind of elaborate, multi-layered ghost story. And when I think of ghost stories, I think of Henry James, who wrote the great ghost story in The Turn of the Screw. So I suppose it was that aspect of James that I was interested in, but also I was interested, as I started thinking about it, in the way that James haunts 20th century fiction, in that just sort of very basic thing of, the tale told from a single point of view, that he really made his own. And so that idea that what is seen is always dependent on who is doing the seeing, and what is not seen is therefore also very important. So it was, so I think that and of course that notion of knowledge being just partial and subjective is a very 20th century notion. So I think James haunts 20th century fiction as well. So I hope that he's a kind of benign ghost in the book itself.
Yes, well, it's very satisfying for those of us who know, what Maisie did, The Turn of the Screw, The Portrait of the Lady. I mean, it is sort of there, churning over as another kind of readerly satisfaction. But Michelle halted her reading of the opening just before the quotation of a very famous Jamesian quote: "Experience is never limited and it is never complete." The rest of that sentence says, "It is an immense sensibility, a kind of huge spider web of the finest silken threads, suspended in the chamber of consciousness and catching every airborne particle in its tissue." So his metaphor for consciousness is one of illimitable possibility and the glory of imagining how very complex, redolent and particular the life of consciousness is. And notwithstanding the terrible spider sort of possibility, the idea is, I think, that it's not just some random adhesiveness that we're experiencing, but that it's acts of attention that give us that fine web that makes life so dense. And I do think you've created beautifully Jamesian characters in this book. I mean, it's a marvel how you've done it, to me, who cannot work in this way. I'm very anyway, I won't talk about my own deficiencies, but Michelle's is a book that reminds you what it is possible to do. But as you were speaking, I was reminded of another very famous Jamesian slogan: try to be one of those on whom nothing is lost. Nothing is lost. So it's about lostness again, but about trying to retrieve, the density of experience through our acts of attention, which includes aesthetic attention to the little plastic fish in the gutter, as well as everything else.
Yes.
So can you say a little bit about Nellie in this?
Yes.
Because I think Nellie's a fascinating character, but very mysterious, and her mystery is never sort of broken open in the text.
Maybe that's one of the problems with the book. I'm not sure, really. I
wasn't saying it as a criticism.
No. I think of it as myself as a criticism. But Nellie, being the artist figure in the book, she collects discarded objects, for instance. And I did want to kind of, in writing about Nellie and in writing about her life, I did want to try and just capture, there's little unremarked things, like the little fish in the street, or fragments of overheard conversation, which I put in the book, or just to cite... I tried to put a lot of visual stuff in the book. So just things that you see walking around the streets. A train going past with lighted windows that looks to me like a ribbon of film lit up. So just as I wanted to just capture what, that idea of moments that make the heart beat faster, because I think that's what Nellie tries to do in the book.
Do you want to have a read of that?
Please, okay.
I know this book very well by now. It's
this is just describing what no longer happens in my suburb, municipal hard rubbish collection. And Tom is just walking past these things on the sidewalk. He passed an orange divan stripped of cushions, collapsed hoovers, torn fly screens, a backless TV. A bicycle wheel leaned against a birdcage. Rusty barbecues might have strayed from a torturer's repertoire. There were contraptions for improving muscle tone, computer keyboards fanned in a magazine rack, plastic flower pots packed with grey earth. It was like leafing through snapshots of a civilization's unconscious.
Thank you.
So what Nellie tries to do, I suppose, which kind of fits in with that passage, is to recuperate what's lost. And I do think that that's one of the functions of art, to try and salvage, to try and pull from... What was it Susan Sontag has a wonderful quote. I think she says something, it's like the grey melt of forgetting.
Time's relentless melt.
Time's relentless melt. Trying to just snatch and preserve moments, sights, sounds, trying to... I think all art, in some sense, as Philip Larkin said, is an attempt to preserve, is raised as a kind of memorial against forgetting.
That's almost how you describe Melbourne. The artistic sort of community is staying somewhere called the Preserve. And it's as though there's a sense that this is a city in which actually gathers up its detritus and its refuse in an aestheticized way, that there are people who attend to the fact that this is a consumer culture based on waste, but waste that can also be
recycled,
reconfigured and reimagined as constitutive of some other vision. But I did want to ask, I will leave time for questions, I promise, but I wanted to ask about bodily waste in this book, because I find it incredibly moving the way you unflinchingly talk about Iris's waste, the fact that her body is disintegrating and that she is entering creatureliness. There's so many forms of creatureliness in this book. And Iris is also haunted by the memory of a lost dog. So right at the end of the book, she remembers that there was a dog that was kind of hidden under the concrete of a building site. And she's a real snob, Iris is, and can't deal with the attentions of a beautiful man called Matthew Ho, who's one of my favourite characters in this book. But she is forced to remember at the end of her life that there's another kind of lost dog, which is the lost bodily integrity. And can you just talk about that a little?
Yes. I mean, I did want to... I wanted to talk about an elderly woman, I suppose, and talk about her both lovingly and unsentimentally, which I also tried to do with the dog. And these are subjects which are hard to write about in a way which is neither callous nor romanticizing. So I describe Iris's just physical decline. I just tried to do that quite plainly and simply, and the effect that it has on her son. But just to sort of go back a little bit, I wanted to write about an elderly woman because as I was thinking about this book, it came to me that there are not many representations of elderly, very elderly women in fiction, I think. And I couldn't... of course, Miss Havisham comes to mind, or... Patrick White has elderly women, wonderful elderly women, and Elizabeth Costello, closer to our time, I suppose. But these tend to be women who wield either economic power, like Miss Havisham, or who wield intellectual power. So Elizabeth Costello is a novelist, and can you think of books in which where there is a fairly major character who is an elderly woman who is poor, who has no kind of who is powerless, and the person I could think of was Doris Lessing, who, is remarkable in that respect, as in so many others in those books like The Diaries of Jane Summers. Writes really wonderfully and movingly about elderly women. So it was part of my wanting to write about Iris was also to recuperate that lost figure. And, make her the subject of fiction. And
she becomes more and more the subject as the novel unfolds. It's a surprise to the reader, yes. I think, how utterly central she is. Yesterday, Michelle gave the most exquisite talk on the ethics of the novel, and how one of the things the novel can allow us to do is to address those sites of disadvantage, those who are marginalized through race, poverty. It sounds sort of formulaic, but not at all. The idea that the powerless within a text might be the source of ethical power, and that our imaginative investment in them gives the whole novel its meaning. I found that very, very interesting, and it does seem to be that it works with Iris in that way. That we move towards loving her. She's cranky, she's not an easy character. Her background, she's both fearful and snobbish, but by the end I think there's so much, you've developed so much tenderness for her position. It's miraculous the way you do it. It's very beautiful. If you haven't read it, you must. I think it's the most wonderful book, and I ask you to thank Michelle.
Please thank Gail. Thank you, Gail.
Thank you.